Shalom Aleichem, welcome all. I wanted to discuss a little bit the tumult, the pulmus, regarding the proper nusach, the proper nikud, under the word hageshem or hagashem, that we're going to say now for the whole duration of the winter. In the winter we add to our tefillah the line of Masha Baruch Mered Hageshem, and it's a surprisingly aggressive controversy between very interesting parties as to what the proper nikud and nusach of that tefillah is, and I wanted to discuss it a little bit from its origins all the way down to its modern duration. Now, it's a shaila that hinges on one nekuda. Is the nekuda that goes under the shin in Masha Baruch Mered Hageshem, the word geshem, is it a kametz, Masha Baruch Mered Hagashem, under the gimel, or is it a segel and it's Masha Baruch Mered Hageshem? Now, I'm sure everybody has heard both versions said by Balei Tefillah over the years. Everyone has seen both versions of the Nekudas and Siddur over the years. Great Paiskim and Gedalim and luminaries on both sides have weighed in. Reb Moshe, Reb Yashiv, the Briskirov, they felt that the proper nusach to say it was with a kametz, Masha Baruch Mered Hagashem. Reb Shlomo Zalman, the Minchas Yitzchak, a bunch of older Hungarian Rabbanim, the Shemin Rekeach, and Rabbi Yisrael Veltz, and others, Minchas Yitzchak, felt that the proper way to say it was Masha Baruch Mered Hageshem with a segel, and the machlokes raged, and believe it or not, there was several, you could call them svarim, several kontrasim / svarim that were written just on this topic alone. There was a mechaber Yid from Eretz Yisrael by the name of Chaim Kraus, who published several versions of a kuntras called Birchas HaChaim, I think in 5 or 6 maduras over the years. Later on, somebody else by the name of it's probably a pen name, by the name of Sar Shalom ben Chaim Merzel, I think he lived in Meir Sharim. He published a kuntras called Meishav Haruach and a kuntras called Kuntras Gvuras Geshamim as rebuttals to Rav Chaim Kreis's kontrasim, who then followed up with a kuntras called Mechalka Chaim B'Chesed to dispute the Meishav Haruach rebuttal to his kuntras. And the fight raged on, and each one of them collected various psakim and anecdotes and stories from Paiskim and Rabbanim who agreed with them and stütz their side. So let's go into a little bit this discussion and break it out. So surprisingly, this entire discussion really hinges, not in Gansen, but primarily hinges upon the credibility of a half from half maskil personality who's not so well known from the late 1700s. There was a Yid by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Satanover. He came from Podolia, I think, from the Ukraine. Eventually, he migrates to Berlin, where he lives part-time, I think, without his family, and he travels back and forth. He becomes actually a tutor to the educated class in Berlin. That's how he supports himself. And he was a prodigious and very capable writer, publisher, editor, etc. And eventually he gets the gig as being in charge of the press of the Maskilim in Berlin, meaning he works for the all the Naftali Herz Wiesel and Moses Mendelssohn, Moshe Dasauer, Moses Mendelssohn, and many of the other leading luminaries in the Maskilic world at the time. Now, a lot of these people that today are referred to as Maskilim were in their day much more, let's say, complex figures. They were frum to a great degree, meaning Yitzchak Satanover looked like a regular frum person. In his head, the hashkafas that he pushed and the ideals that he was pushing and the differences and the changes that he was looking to institute were today what in hindsight are referred to as Haskalah, but it was less clear and delineated back in the day. He himself was a Talmud Chacham and a credible person on some level, although his hashkafas and his ideals were somewhat questionable. Now, because of that, he had a very mixed reputation. Even, I think, amongst his friends, he was referred to with some level of derision. Supposedly, Moses Mendelssohn himself said about him that he's a chatzi min and a chatzi maimin, which meant to say he was a good for nothing to nobody, meaning nobody could use him. The Maskilim couldn't benefit from him because he wasn't a full Maskil, and the Charedim couldn't benefit from him because he wasn't a full Charedi. So, nobody was happy with him. Others, of his own era, said the Maimar Muskar about him. We'll get this in a second, actually. But there was many of his own era who were critical of him, meaning from his own chug, from his own camp of the Maskilim, there was many who were critical of Rabbi Yitzchak Satanavar. Now, he published several different svarim in his lifetime. He published a sefer called Svas Emes, which was on diktuk, where his main expertise lay, meaning his main expertise was his knowledge of the Hebrew language and punctuation and vowelization and etc. And he was an expert at diktuk. He so to speak, updated some of the older diktuk svarim, like from the Radak and etc. It hadn't been updated in a while, so he somewhat, authoritatively updated those svarim. That was where his main, field of expertise, you could say, was. He got haskamas from various gedolim for the sefer. Later on, he also published a whole potpourri of interesting svarim, and under a whole collection of pseudonyms and pen names, very, very murky provenance for all his svarim. Some of them, portrayed themselves as being very ancient. They mimicked the styles of the Zayar or the styles of the Nevi'im. He wrote, a sefer called what was his so to speak, his real contribution was a sefer called Mishlei Asaf. Now Asaf is an acronym for Aleph is Itzik, Samach is Satanov, and Pei is Palanya, which would be like his nom de jour. He was signing off, but this was very controversial in the time because he was, so to speak, mischaracterizing and misrepresenting his contribution. Now, this at the time, many of these from Maskilim who were trapped in from circles and from society, and yet had very revolutionary and new ideas that they wanted to share. So what they would do is they would present these ideas as if they were ancient, and they would hide them like under a different name. For example, we've spoken in the past that more than likely Reb Shaul Berlin, who was a Talmud Chacham, Muvik, a well-established Talmud Chacham, a son of the Av Bezdin of Berlin, a Gadol Hador caliber Talmud Chacham, Reb Tzvi Ersh Levin, published his famous Sefer B'Samim Reish, which portended to be Chuvas from the Rush, where he then wrote his Bir Kasa the Harsana, and that was a way of slipping in his own ideals and his own hashkafas into the discourse under a more acceptable format. Now, Yitzchak Satanavar took a similar course, and he also, through various different pen names and pseudonyms and obfuscations, he slid his literature into the corpus of Jewish literature in this manner. Now, what he interestingly did, which makes everything about him a little even more murky, is he would write his own haskamas to his svarim, and he would sign names of various gedolim on there, and somewhat shamelessly, he would even write in some of those haskamas that, like he has haskama from the Prima Gadim to one of his svarim. Now, more than likely, the Prima Gadim never gave this haskama, and the Prima Gadim himself writes that the sefer that's presented is of unknown origin, and who knows, maybe the guy who found it even wrote it himself. But we trust him, and he's a good guy, and therefore trust the sefer. So he was almost like brazen in his trickery to try to introduce his literature and his works into the body of Jewish literature. Now, because of this, because he couldn't be relied on, and because he had no problem meshing the truth with lies, and because he would even write his own haskamas tisvarim, so everything that he does is somewhat untrustworthy. Ad kedei kach that there came a point where people would say about his farm, this is from the Maskilim world, they would say this about his farm, they said what's interesting isn't new, and what's interesting isn't new, and what's new isn't interesting. Meaning his own stuff is worthless, and whatever he puts there that is interesting is just stolen or copy-pasted from somewhere else, and it's not even interesting. Meaning, so he had a very, very murky provenance. And even in the Maskilic world, where he was some sort of luminary, and later Maskilim, held him to be a great contributor to the evolution of the Hebrew language and to the world of Diktuk and etc., his contributions have a big, a few asterisks on them as to what the exact provenance is. Now, one of his main contributions that was accepted more widely was he published a Siddur called Vayetar Yitzchak. Now, the Siddur Vayetar Yitzchak, its main contribution that he did is he leveraged his great expertise in the field of Diktuk, and he updated and annotated and corrected all the various Diktuk errors that had made their way into the Siddur over the years, and he produced what he considered to be a better and more proper Diktuk-wise, like upon him Siddur, with all the Nosach HaTfilah. Now, he's not the only one who tried to do this. Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Wolf Hindenheim and others also, each one Al Mekaymai endeavored to do this, but the Siddur Vayetar Yitzchak was a real contribution in this regard. Now, in the Siddur Vayetar Yitzchak is where one of the first times this annotation, call it correction to the nusach, is made. And it goes as follows. It seems, and this is a point of great contention and great dispute, but it seems that at an earlier point in time, most Siddurim would say, Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem, which is again what's popular today. Came along Rabbi Yitzchak Satanavar, and he said, according to the rules of Diktuk, it needs to say Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem. So why is that? Without going too deeply into the details of the rules of Diktuk, it's a pretty simple rule. The idea is as follows. Anytime the word is at the end of a statement, it's the end of a phrase, it's the end of a statement, that the letter over there, that nakuda becomes a kametz instead of a segel. And there's many rayas to this in Psukim. There's a pasuk in Zechariah, for example, that says Lo Yelechem Yerid HaGoshem, and the nusach is Goshem, not Geshem, because it's the end of a pasuk. For example, there's other Psukim that say the pasuk in Malachim says Allah Achel V'Shesa Ki Koil Hamoyin HaGoshem, because it's the end of the pasuk. The pasuk in Malachim in pasuk Memdalad says Lo Yatzrecha HaGoshem, again HaGoshem. In Kaihelis and Yud Beis Beis, there's a pasuk like that. And there's many examples, and Rabbi Yitzchak Satanavar collected all these examples, and the contrasim that were produced later to defend this position, to do it with the comments, produced many examples throughout Tefillah and Psukim, etc. For example, even the bracha that we make, Bar Pri Hagafen, has a comment for the same reason. Meaning, it seems to be a pretty well-established rule that in Diktuk, when this is the end of a statement, the word should be sounded out Gashem instead of Geshem. Now, because of this rule, said Rabbi Yitzchak Satanavar, the Diktuk rule would dictate that the proper nikud under the word Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem has to be Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem, and because of that, he edited the Siddur Vayeta Yitzchak, and after him, many other Siddurim caught on to this correction, so to speak, and it became adopted by almost everybody to the point where in the 1950s and 60s, when the beginning, even later, 70s and 80s, when this pulmus was developing on how to sound out this word and how the Siddurim should be it, the normal standard practice was to say Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem. That was the normal standard practice. Now today I think that's changed already, and today the normal standard practice is to say Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem. It's back to the older minig, the way it was maybe hundreds of years ago. And how and why that happened is all connected to this fight between Rav Chaim Kreuz and the Mechaber of the country's Meshav Ruach. Now, but like I said, ultimately a big chelik of this discussion really hinges upon how trustworthy or how falaslach, how much should we be paying attention to Yitzchak Satanavar's corrections. Now, one camp would say, okay, Yitzchak Satanavar was a bit of a plagiarizer, he was a forger, he was not honest at all, he wrote all sorts of askamas and svarim on the false names and etc. But one thing he actually knew was Diktuk, he did know Diktuk well, and therefore his correction that he made based on the rules of Diktuk, where he's providing the evidence, he's providing the receipts, it seems to be accurate, it seems to be a correct correction, so what's wrong to accept from him? And Reb Moshe in a tshuva in Orach Chaim Chelik Daled, Reb Moshe Taka says this. Reb Moshe says that how to be naked the words comes based on the trop, which the Gemara in the Dharma, the Flamet Zayin, and the way Tosfos and the Rosh learn the Gemara, it seems to be halach l'mishum Sinai. So if this is halach l'mishum Sinai, that means that in Siddur and the Nusach HaTefillah also the nikud should be correct. So therefore the correct nikud in this word is Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem, and therefore that's the way to pronounce it. Similarly, Rebbe Yashiv, who was approached by the Mechaber of the country's Meshav Ruach, and later on to many other people, told them that the proper nikud is to say Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem, and there is no reason not to do it just because Yitzchak Satanav was the one who told us about it. He said, so what? So he himself was maybe a questionable person, of questionable character, and who, maybe lied and plagiarized in all his svarim, but Afal Pikin, there's no reason not to not to listen to him when he says it. So to speak, Kabelas Emes Misha Amrei. He said it's true, who cares? Now, it's interesting, I found an article in Hebrew Mishpacha from years ago when Rabbi Lapiansky was working on the first, editions of his Siddur. It seems he had a whole discussion with the writer over there, and in it he says over a very interesting anecdote about his meeting with Rabbi Yashiv. He writes that when he went to meet Rabbi Yashiv to discuss his Siddur project, Rabbi Yashiv asked him, one of the things Rabbi Yashiv asked him was about is, what's the nikud that you're putting under the word Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem? Are you doing Gashem or Geshem? And he says he told Rabbi Yashiv that he's doing Geshem, which is which is how it should be, because that's how he was taken in by the country's Mechalka Chaim B'Chesed and by Birchas Chaim, and that's how hundreds of Siddurim had it for hundreds of years, and there's no reason to change it just because a maskil of questionable character changed it. To which Rabbi Yashiv told him, but the Prima Gadim quotes Rabbi Yitzchak Satanavar a few times in the Sefer, and there's Haskam from the Prima Gadim on Rabbi Yitzchak Satanavar Svaram Sakid Yamacham Avek, arguing in the Prima Gadim. Rabbi Yashiv asked him, So Ram Lapiansky says that he showed Rabbi Yashiv all the information that there is available on Yitzchak Satanover and all his malfeasance and everything that he did in all his works. And Rabbi Yashiv, he says, was nishtaimim. He didn't know what to say. Now, I don't think that Rabbi Yashiv backed down from his position, because Rabbi Yashiv nonetheless felt that the edit that Rabbi Yitzchak Satanover was making was a correct edit. And in the Kuntras Meishav Ruach, he brings that when he went to speak to Rabbi Yashiv told him as follows. He asked Rabbi Yashiv, is there a problem with following this edit of Yitzchak Satanover because it came from a bad person or a bad source? And the source that he brought that it should be a problem is a tshuva that we've actually discussed in the past, where Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas writes that even though the Shabsai Tzvi Kat instituted in Amsterdam, I believe, a fine minig of duchening every Shabbos, which is something that was really like Machzar Torah Ligashna, which was a good thing. But since it came from Kat Shatz, it came from the bad circles, you have to take it away. So this Mechaber asked Rabbi Yashiv, so seemingly, even if Yitzchak Satanover was correct, that Mashav Ruach Mered HaGashim is the proper way to do it al pi diktuk, and diktuk is the right way to read it, like the Gemara in the Dharma says, like Ramesha says, but maybe since it comes from a bad source, we shouldn't stick with it. To which Rabbi Yashiv told him, no, there's a difference between something that they introduced, the adherents of Shabtai Tzvi introduced, to bolster their movement, or to lead up to some sort of geula thing. It was part of their avodah, what they were trying to stelline in Klal Yisrael, was duchening, and it was included in their whole, angle and agenda. As opposed to Yitzchak Satanover, who, he had questionable hashkafas, and he had questionable character and questionable, literary standards, but that doesn't mean that this was an agenda piece. This has nothing to do with an agenda. This is just that he was a baki in the inyanim of diktuk, and he edited it accordingly. So Rabbi Yashiv said to stick with it. Now, interestingly, is in the Kuntras Meishav Ruach, and I'm not taken by this particular detail, I'm from the camp, I guess, that buys the idea that Yitzchak Satanover was a maskil, and was a bit of a liar, and had no problem slipping things in. Now, I don't know that means, like Rabbi Yashiv says, I don't know that means that you can't trust an edit that he makes in diktuk, especially if he's providing the receipts, and he's showing many psukim and much precedent that this is the proper way to do it. But I do believe that he was a maskil of questionable character. Now, in the Kuntras Meishav Ruach, once he's dealing with the entire, with the entirety of the issue, he goes all the way to say that Yitzchak Satanover was not a questionable character, and he brings rayas from the various haskamas that he had and the different gedolim that quoted him or interacted with him. Now, today, I think many believe that a lot of those haskamas are forged, and that although certain gedolim quote him, Prima Gadim certainly quotes him, it doesn't mean that he knew, all of his character and all of his, so to speak, character flaws, and therefore it's possible that he could be quoted and was able to, weasel his way into rabbinic discourse here and there, because he wasn't an Amaretz, and he was a Talmid Chacham, and he was, a firm person in his personal life. But it still doesn't mean that he wasn't a person of questionable character. But yeah, that's l'chayr not machriya for that l'chayr is not a deal breaker as to ignore his edit. Now, so what is the so to speak tinus against his edit? What was Rav Chaim Kreuz's main rebuttal and push against this piece? Now, a lot of the basic premise of Yitzchak Satanover's edit over here relies upon the fact that Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem is an addition to the Tefillah that essentially has nothing to do really with Bracha of Tchiyas HaMesim. The Bracha of Tchiyas HaMesim is a complete bracha. We say it half the year without Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem. When we insert Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem, it's because the Gemara in Brachas tells us that's where we're maskir. We stick it into Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem. The Gemara in Brachas tells us on the Lamed Aleph, I think, that maskiring v'urs kishamim b'tchiyas hamesim. That's where we stick it in. Now, why? So the Gemara in Tainus and Daf Zayin seems to say that gadol yem kishamim b'tchiyas hamesim. There's some sort of similarities, or such type of limudim that tell us that that's the proper placement. But that doesn't make it part of the bracha. It's still a statement. Farzech Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem is a statement on its own that's maskir a certain ma'ila of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that itself is a certain type of tefillah. And therefore, since it's not connected to Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem, it's an independent statement. And when it's an independent statement, the way to say it is Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem, which implies that it's the end of a statement. That's the basic, underpinning, rationale, halachic underpinning of Yitzchak Satanover's diuk edit. Now comes along the Rav Chaim Kreuz, and he collects various different letters and different rayas and different rishonim and etc. that seem to say that the connection that Mashav Ruach Mered HaGeshem has with the bracha of Mechayim Esim is somewhat more intrinsic and more really interwoven. Although it's not there the whole year, and although if you forget it, you can add it at the end of the bracha. Afal Pikein, the reason why Chazal put it there is because they see you read this Kishamim as a form of Tchias HaMesim. The Avudraham writes this in a few places, and others make such references. The Torah brings a similar type of idea. So since we're saying that it's more intrinsically connected to the Bracha Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, although granted one cannot say it's an integral piece, because we certainly don't say it the whole year, but Afal Bika in Hayos, it is essentially connected to the tefillah of Tchias HaMesim. So therefore, it's not considered like an ending. It's considered one long run-on sentence. And since it's one long run-on sentence, we have no reason to say Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, and we should leave it how it was in hundreds of Siddur, Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, the way it was. Now, this Rav Chaim Kreuz did an amazing job at collecting every rabbi of note's opinion. I will absolutely not be able to say each one's shita and each one's letters. I'll try to sample from the few of the main important ones, just to get a flavor of it. And if someone wants to see more of it, he could look up the Sefer Birchas HaChaim, and the Sefer Mechalkel Chaim B'Chesed, and the Kunshas Meishav Ruach, and all of these things I discuss more in detail. And before I go into some of the letters that he collected, Rav Chaim Kreuz, I just want to share one thing. He does bring, this is not a letter, but he brings that he spoke to Rafal Soloveitchik, who told him that the Brisker Rav said that the proper way to say it is Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, the way he wants to say it. Now, incidentally, in the Sefer Meishav Ruach, from the other Mechaber who writes on this, he writes that he spoke to Rabbi Ephraim Burdyansky, who was the Chazan in the Brisker Rav's house, and says that the Brisker Rav told him to say Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem with a kametz. Now, each one of them, in their later editions, where they write again about it, is sticking to their story, and each one of them insists that his version of the Brisker Rav's Hanaga is correct. Now, how could I say one way or the other? I don't know. I could say one thing, that it does seem that the Minig Hagra was to say Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem. And it could be that also had a big influence on Rabbi Yashiv and Rabbi Moshe, and why they insisted to stay with Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, even though there was all this critique about it. Now, we know this from a few different places. Incidentally, the Siddur from Naftali Hertz Wiesel, I'm sorry, not absolutely not, from Naftali Hertz, who was the Rav of Yafo, I believe, who was from the Talmidei Hagra, Talmud of Yitzchak Chaver, who published what we call today the Nusach Hagra, the Siddur Hagra. Although there's critique, and the Minchas Elazar says there's no such thing, and others hold like that also, but whatever the Siddur Hagra is, it does have this version of Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem with the comments. Additionally, Rav Moshe Shmuel Shapiro, I believe, said over that he heard from his father, I think, who heard from Rafal Shapiro, who heard from the Netziv, who heard from Ritzela, who heard from Chaim, who heard from the Goyin, the regular Shalshal HaMaseira. Not that they heard directly, but if they said it that way, they must have heard it that way. And it seems like there's good precedent to say that the Goyin's minig was to say Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, like Yitzchak Satanover's correction. Now, if that would be the case, that could explain why the Brisker Rav would have said Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem with the comments and not Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem. Now, either way, Yavei Achai v'Yakash is Achai. There's no way to say. Each one of them says that he did the research and spoke to people who were there, and then says that it agrees with him. So I don't have a way to be machriya. What I will say is that Rabbi Soloveitchik from Boston in Harari Kedem in Simon Kov Samach Vav, he has a whole shtickle Torah where he's discussing the lumdus of the insertion of Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, meaning what we handled a little bit, if it's connected to the bracha, if it's not connected to the bracha. And he's going through some of these sources from the Gemara and Tainis and various Rishonim, like we mentioned, that seem to imply that it is connected or it isn't connected, and he comes to the conclusion that it isn't connected. It's its own Shavach, and therefore he says, Hini Yedua, I'll read, he says, Hini Yedua, Mashenechliku Rabim Benusach HaAskar Shal Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, if you have to say it with the comments, because it's the completion of a thing on its own. Now this is an interesting edus that he's bringing. The Rabbi Soloveitchik was a big brisker. He says this is the minig of all the yeshivas, and the minig of the Yidden in Europe, the minig of all the yeshivas over there. Or he says, or do we say that we change it? And he brings a little bit of discussion. He ends up concluding and saying that the way to do it properly is to say it with the comments, because it has nothing to do, it's its own, and this is the proper diktuk fix. So here you have again some sort of gvia seder, so to speak, of a brisker, somewhere from the brisker line being made on some level that this is the way the briskers did it. So again, I can't say with certainty, and I certainly don't know what they do today, bisman hazeh, after all the dust has settled. But the Brisker Rav's shita on this is a point of contention. Now, I just want to sample a few of the chuvas that the Berchus Chaim brings in his kuntras that he collected. In the first volume of Berchus Chaim, in the first salvo, so to speak, to prove that it should be Masha Baruch HaMered HaGeshem, he gets a haskama or a letter of hamlatza from Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, the Minchas Yitzchak, and from Rav Shach. and both of them agree with him, and say that the proper way to say it is to say with a segel, the way he says Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem, because like you showed us, saying Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem is a shinoi, it's a change, it's something new that was introduced by the Maskilim, Chadash Asman Ateres, stay away from the Maskilim, and just do the old way like you're proving and don't do anything different. Now, but neither one of them goes into it in great detail. And in the countries over here, he brings from many sources. He brings from the Shemin Rekeach, who was an old Hungarian Rav, and he brings from the Minchas Elazar, who writes about it, and he brings from Yisrael Veltz, and the Levushei Mordechai, the Madir Rav. There's many, many, many different quotations from different ones. I'm not going to be able to go into all of them. We all seem to agree with what he's saying, that that it should be Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem, the way it was before Yitzchak Satanova tampered with it. Now, there's an interesting letter in the second volume of Birchas Chaim that he brings from Rosh Zalman. I want to read it in its entirety, because it's a fascinating little letter. Rosh Zalman writes as follows. He says, I'll express my view of this. He says, you already collected many askamas from Gedolei Torah. You don't need my opinion. He says, Im kol zeh, nisarti lahavtzarasa, I have given in to your begging. I'll be moisif. This is very interesting. He says, until now, he says, my personal meaning was to say, Masha Baruch Mered HaGoshem with a kametz tachas hagimel. After I read everything that you wrote in your country's Hachashav Birchas Chaim, I changed my minig and I started saying it with a segel like you said it. The most important diktuk that a person could do, it's a fascinating line from Shlomo Zalman. He says the biggest diktuk, more important than shtelling to the rules of diktuk and saying to the tefillah properly according to the rules of diktuk, is l'shmaya divrei chacham meshadaitim das Torah. Befrat shekvei tirase maybe b'kontroise dvarim kas v'shein ze klal neged klal diktuk, and befrat that you explained how it could even shtim with diktuk. So for sure the right way is to listen to the Gedolim, he says, listen to Rav Shach, listen to the Minchas Yitzchak, and make the change to Hagoshem with a comments. Now, incidentally, in the Chassidish world, he quotes over here, he brings letters from Shmuel Vosner, Nosson Gestetner, and others. It seems that, and Minchas Elazar really alludes to this in a few places, in Darkei Chaim V'Shalom, in Ois Chaim V'Shalom, in Ar Torah, in a few different places, he writes that the minig amongst the Chassidim seem to have always been, and this probably is true because the earliest misnagdim to the change in the minig was from the Hungarian Chassidish world, like the Shemin Rekeach and etc. It seems by the Chassidim, the minig always was to say Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem, and they never made the change. It's mostly, primarily in the Ashkenazi world where the change was made, that this whole Mulchama was made to change it back to Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem. So now, I'll just end with this, although I obviously cannot be machri in the Shaila, and whichever route one wants to go, there are great Paiskim and Gedolim on both sides. We could only observe that it seems that Rav Chaim Kreuz was successful in his crusade to have this change back to Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem. And I think that by now, the primary nusach that you'll hear people doing is Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem. I think in most Siddurim, and this is a lot of it, he had this changed on his own. He wrote to the editor of Siddurim, and all of this is in his Contrasim, is all in the Pulmus over there, was changed to primarily say Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem. And although some of them will have in parentheses or brackets the other version, today primarily, I think he won the battle. In any case, it's a fascinating little discussion where ultimately the core discussion hinges on the credibility of a from Maskil from hundreds of years ago, and obscure discussion in Hilchos Diktuk. And although ultimately analyzing all the facts over here, it would seem that Yitzchak Satanover is more correct with the rules of Diktuk, but many Gedolim felt that this was a change that isn't important or isn't necessary or goes against the Messiah, or even felt that this is not a violation of the rules of Diktuk. And therefore, over time, the version that won out was Masha Baruch Mered HaGeshem. Okay, Hatzlacha.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.